Way to start this. A little bit of energy. Good stuff. So it's a pleasure to be here with you to chat about migration and food security from a global and Canadian policy perspective. And I first want to start off by thanking Winnie and her team for organizing this great event. I think it was much needed, and I want to thank all of you. So my plan is to provide a backdrop and a brief context on the state of Canada's fundamental shift towards brutality, exploitation, and abuse by way of the Temporary Foreign Worker Program. Now, as I mentioned earlier, at best, this is a program that is modern-day indentured servitude. Worst-case scenario, this is modern-day slavery. So let me dive right into my thesis as my time is limited. The aim of my presentation is to delve into the idea that to have sustainable and secure food in Canada, we must also have just labor practices, particularly with regard to labor from the Global South. Now, based on our 2 decades of working with migrant workers at our 10 migrant worker centers across the country, I would suggest that UFCW Canada is in a unique position to provide a reliable and genuine account of the current national situation regarding migrant workers. Now, as the largest private sector union in the country, UFCW Canada annually comes face-to-face with more than 50,000 migrant workers. Now, that's greater than any other organization, any NGO, and any government, including the federal government. Moreover, UFCW Canada has the largest percentage out of any union of its membership being migrant workers. Now, this is beyond just agriculture. This is meat packing, processing, and food retailing. Now, we should be clear that increasingly the SOP, the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program, is a less preferred option for agricultural employers. And what we are seeing is more and more employers bringing employees under the more ruthless and less regulated low-skilled pilot project. Now, this is leaving sending countries with very few roads in an attempt to regulate conditions faced by their nationals when the political will in those countries actually exists. Even countries that had typically utilized the SOP are seeing an increasing number of their workers coming to Canada under the Temporary Foreign Worker Program. And as such, rather than comment specifically on the SOP, which my co-panelists have a keen expertise on, I'll broaden my discussion to include the Temporary Foreign Worker Program as it relates to migrant worker justice. As well, the UFCW Canada's concern has generally emphasized migrant worker justice, the migrant worker justice end of the discussion. So I'll leave my comments relating to secure and sustainable food to the experts on the panel. However, we're very clear in that to have sustainable food systems, you must have one that treats workers in a process that is fair and equitable. Now, Canada's Temporary Foreign Worker Program and its various streams allows employers to import migrant workers on a temporary basis as commodities, as one would bring in iron, wheat, fuel, or other staples of production. And it's rife with horrible stories of suffering, abuse, and exploitation. From a policy perspective, this is a made-in-Canada legal and policy disaster. As such, from an economic and social perspective, the Temporary Foreign Worker Program is certainly unsustainable. Some of our large employers tell us, year after year, we bring in temporary foreign workers where there is allegedly a need, and the federal government tells us 2 to 4 years later, these workers need to go. And employers, from their perspective, say, we lose skill sets, we lose goodwill with these workers. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. In fact, it's well understood by those who work with migrant workers that it is a historic and national embarrassment. What I'd like to do this afternoon is clearly dispel the utterly nonsensical mythology propagated by the Canadian federal government and employers, and even some academics, that the Temporary Foreign Worker Program is a model system to be imitated by others. In fact, the federal Canadian government's PR machine has done an admirable job in selling the Temporary Foreign Worker Program across Europe as this well-oiled machine that is a model for the world's receiving countries. So let me be clear about this. There is no doubt that the Temporary Foreign Worker Program is a model program. It's a model program for 21st century brutality, racism, classism, and a varying degree of government-sponsored exploitative measures carefully camouflaged to have the appearance of a finely manicured garden. The truth of the matter is, the garden, upon closer inspection, is plagued by weeds of greed and fertilized so fully with inhumanity. International policymakers considering emulating the Canadian program would be wise to take a closer look. So let's look firstly at the international picture to give a context to my commentary on Canada. Now, the IOM estimates that there are 240 million people living outside of Canada as migrant workers. By 2050, that number is going to increase to 400 million people. And migrant workers are present in every sector of the economy around the world, including construction, manufacturing, hotels and restaurants, healthcare, education services, the service industry, and agriculture, of course. And the global economic crisis, to say the least, was a catastrophe for migrant workers across the planet. It had a tremendously negative effect on migrant workers who are concentrated on sectors hardest hit by the crisis. That would be agriculture, construction, manufacturing, hotels and restaurants, just to name a few. Perceived or actual competition for scarce jobs puts downward pressure on wages in destination countries and spurs the xenophobic and discriminatory reactions of nationals against migrant workers and their families. Now, with respect to the world of the G8, remember those guys who were down a couple of years ago and then a lot of people got beat up? With respect to the G8, we see the economic crisis being utilized as a mechanism to expedite the downward pressure on wages and benefits for both union and non-union blue-collar and white-collar workers. And that downward pressure has existed since 1973. In short, that gap between the haves and the have-nots continues to grow. In the name of labor flexibility and efficiency, migrant workers are utilized as non-voting, silent, cheaper workers, as a commodity for employers to utilize. Now, if we play this out over several decades, I suggest that we in the West are simply moving towards an economy, and with all the dilemmas attached to it, of a developing country. And that a highly vulnerable and precarious migrant workforce is simply an important piece of that devolution of the neoliberal economic model. With this in mind, there has been significant shift towards the utilization of migrant workers over the past 2 decades across Canada, the EU, Japan, Korea, and a number of other countries. One place where the numbers actually remain stable is in the United States, where they've had about 400,000 migrant workers come every year. And the reason for this is that they have an even more vulnerable population of workers who are within the United States without status. This is the ultimate labor force for flexibility and efficiency. So that's the global picture in 2 minutes. In recent years, the number of temporary foreign workers admitted to Canada has more than doubled. According to CIC, Citizenship and Immigration Canada, in 2009, the number of permanent residents who entered Canada totaled 252,000. The number of migrant workers who were here during the same year was 280,000. That data reflects a targeted shift from a governmental model favoring the entry of permanent residents, whom would have equal access to legal rights and a path to citizenship, to migrant workers who are faced with precarious immigration status and more limited rights as would permanent residents. The consequences of such a shift have inevitably created a perpetually vulnerable and exploited workforce. Now think about it this way, approximately 5% of the Canadian population shows up on our doorstep year after year after year, and that percentage is increasing. This is nonetheless nothing less than a glacial shift in front of our eyes to the delight of many employers and governments. Between 2002 and 2008, the number of temporary foreign workers present in Canada rose by a whopping 148%, while the total entries of those workers, that is the sum of initial entries and re-entries, rose by 73%. While the 2 flagships of the Canadian Temporary Labour Migration Programs, namely the SOP and the Live-in Caregiver Program, have remained relatively stable over the years, the Temporary Foreign Worker Program has undergone seismic changes in its purpose, size, and target populations. And yet, the Temporary Foreign Worker Program operates largely below the radar of public debate. However, in 2002, the Canadian government chose to expand the ways in which employers, including farm operators, could access migrant labor. Billed as the pilot project, and you'd think a pilot project means it's not going to be around for too long, but a pilot project called the Temporary Foreign Workers Program for occupations requiring lower levels of formal training. So what came of it? Employers were offered access to workers from across the global south with even less protections and supervisions than the SOP. And the result has created a pool of competing migrant workers who are vulnerable and sometimes powerless. Because of the LowSkilled Pilot Project program provides even less protections and oversight than the SOP, employers in numerous industries have turned to the LowSkilled Pilot as their program of choice. For the workers, it is a choice that typically leaves them completely in the arbitrary control of the employer. In fact, the majority of people who now enter Canada are not determined by the accountable and elected people that we see on Parliament Hill, but they are determined by determined by corporations. And so we have codified a program by where, pursuant to the new norms of globalization and liberalized trade, work is sent away from the West to the globalized South, and where it can't be sent away, we import workers to the global North. Now, despite official claims that the temporary foreign worker program is, of course, temporary, research has shown that the temporary foreign worker program has indeed become pervasive and is a fundamental feature of the Canadian labor market. Our employers and our governments, I can tell you, would have it no other way. Like most of the Western world in the global South, Canadian migrant workers are disproportionately racialized and from low-income countries. In 2006, 63% of temporary foreign workers in Canada were from low-income countries, and 62% were racialized. Policymakers seem to have never considered how the Canada's temporary foreign worker program encourages employers to import predominantly racialized workers from low-income countries, and an inherently racist and classist policy that masquerades as in the development paradigm in an era of globalization. So workers under the temporary foreign worker program are often isolated geographically, linguistically, with no social network and no real support mechanisms. While minimum wage is usually the contracted wage, under the threat of deportation, many workers earn significantly less. Even if they had an understanding of how to enforce those rights, how do they do this and hire a lawyer without being terminated or repatriated? It's generally impossible. The result is a group of workers that is regularly isolated and marginalized. Despite numerous cases being brought to light over decades, there has been no significant changes to the temporary foreign worker program designed to effectively address these seemingly conscious, long-standing program shortcomings. It is clear that unlike their professional counterparts, these so-called low-skilled workers are subjected to numerous rights violations, and they're tied to a single employer, and in many cases required to either live with the employer or rely on the employer for housing and transportation. In addition, low-skilled migrant workers are not permitted to bring their families to Canada, and must endure the duration of their contract living apart from their spouses, partners, and children. And in 2009, Canada's highly respected Auditor General conducted a review of the temporary foreign worker program. Her report made it clear that reforms to Canada's immigration system are increasingly shifting responsibilities away from the federal government to the provinces and employers. And she took direct aim at the temporary foreign worker program. The AG said that little is being done to catch the abuses occurring on all sides of the program. Workers are particularly vulnerable. She said that given that they owe their status to their employer, they live at the employer's mercy. And Ms. Fraser was blunt. Her report states there has been no systematic follow-up by either CIC or HRSDC to verify that employers are complying with the terms and the conditions under the LMO application under which they were approved to be in Canada, or whether such wages are being paid or accommodations are even being provided. I can tell you, sisters and brothers, the temporary foreign worker program is akin to the old Wild West. There's rules, but no one looks at them. And the rules that are there are poor to begin with. Admirers of the temporary foreign worker program are closing their eyes to the egregious and extensive violations of workers' rights, as well as damaging implications to labour market planning and immigration policy. So UFCW Canada, as I mentioned, we come into contact with more migrant workers than any organization in the country, including the federal government. We can tell you that these are common themes that we see from St. John's to Victoria. So what have we been able to do about it? Well, we started to operate agricultural workers alliance centers. They offer everything from settlement services to taxation filings to filling out EI claims. Since we can't work with our own federal government, we started to reach out to other governments. We have deals with Mexican states, including Guatemala, where we do that pre-organizing organizing. We have an office in Mexico City. We offer free online education to migrant workers across Canada. And on top of that, in raising the profile of the issue, we offer online courses relating to the state of migrant workers in Canada, and we offer those courses to our 250,000 members across the country. We offer migrant worker scholarship. And think about the need here. In just 2 years, we've had over 9,000 applications for only $10,000. Our email list goes up to 10,000 people 3 times a week to ensure that people are receiving the message of migrant workers and what they're going through. And through our collective agreements, we've been able to facilitate getting thousands upon thousands of migrant workers into Canada through provincial nominee programs. And I just want to end off by talking about this initiative that we're here for. Our recent initiative was something very simple: raising money for the survivors and families of those who had fallen in the tragic Hampstead accident this year in February. And as I mentioned earlier, we were able, not just UFCW Canada alone, but across Canada, labor organizations, community allies, individuals sitting on their couch, giving thousands upon thousands of dollars, were able to raise that $250,000. The campaign now leads into the next phase, the Right to Stay campaign. And as you heard from Juan and Javier, the next question to be determined is, what is Canada's responsibility? When we import human beings as commodities, when we have individuals who come to Canada because it is difficult for them to make ends meet back home, and they come healthy and able-bodied, and they are injured, how is Canada accountable when workers are now 50 to 60% of what they used to be? How do these workers who could barely make ends meet back home as able-bodied individuals carry on and not be burdens on their families back home? Our fear is that, and this is based on things that we've seen so many times before, is that this federal government will simply get Juan and Javier to a point of recovery and send them back home and forget about them. And our goal is simply this, that Canada is accountable, and as such, the appropriate thing to do, and the fair thing to do, and the just thing to do, is to ensure that Juan and Javier receive permanent status in Canada along with their family. That is the thing that Canadians are responsible for. If we're going to bring workers in, we need to ensure that workers have a right to stay in Canada if they so choose. And as such, we have put together an activist team, a team of immigration lawyers, personal injury lawyers, WSIB specialists, community allies, and we've spoken to the federal New Democrats, and we're working all together to ensure that there is that strong national public campaign. And we've been working on this for a couple of months now. But what we need is you. We need your support over the months to come, which might turn into years. But we want to ensure that we have everybody together, that this isn't just a very narrow campaign, that this is a campaign where all of Canada hears the voices of Juan and Javier. And for you to get involved, I want you to see my friend Emma Lopez, who's translating to my left. The Temporary Foreign Worker Program continues to be a dark, painful, and dreary road wrought with abuse, exploitation, and utter lack of oversight for tens of thousands of people entering Canada every year. As shocking as it may be for those to deny this reality, who are primarily governments and employers, parallels have been made to the slave trade and indentured servitude of a colonial era that we had thought had passed. Moreover, the number of people in Canada who are unaware of this sometimes subhuman conditions that migrant workers are subjected to is quite shocking. I wish I was embellishing, I wish I was exaggerating, but the state of non-union migrant workers in Canada is one of precariousness and crisis. Together, however, I am confident that by raising the profile of these horrible conditions and empowering migrant workers, that we will be able to turn the tide and change this migration system into a more humane immigration system. Thank you very much.